Yeah, first of all, I want to thank Chaim and Boas for organizing this wonderful conference and especially for letting me speak here. Before I will try to outline the connection between contemporary perceptions of crisis in masculinity and anti-Semitism, I give you a very short definition of the term populism, how it is used in US historiography. Populism, or the term populism, described a predominantly agrarian movement of the 1890s, and so it is not to be confused with the meaning of the term populism as it is used in our days. So I will go to my topic. Start with the caricature you can see. On April 15th, 1896, The Sound Money, a magazine which promoted the worldviews of the populist movement, published a cartoon titled History Repeats Itself. The caricature, drawn by Watson Heston, depicts a suffering and crucified Uncle Sam, maltreated and plundered by 4 men. 2 of them represent the 2 big parties of the US, the Republicans and the Democrats. Behind them you can see 2 Jews labeled as Wall Street pirates who hold a lance named Single Gold Standard or a sponge of vinegar named Interest on Bonds. They use these tools to torture Uncle Sam and to injure his body. As a sign, this is US in the hands of Jews makes clear, in the mind of Heston, Jews controlled the US and ruined the nation by plundering it. By describing Jews as the driving forces behind the 2 big parties, the cartoon identified an alleged Jewish conspiracy as the cause of a perceived crisis of the United States of America in general and of Anglo-American men in particular. The construction of Jews as initiators of a conspiracy against Anglo-American people and interwoven perception of an emasculation of Anglo-American men caused by Jews evokes questions historians should try to answer, but haven't done so far. What kind of reasons prevailed for these perceptions of crisis? Why did contemporaries link Jews with an alleged crisis of Anglo-American men? Why could a connection between these perceptions of crisis in masculinity and anti-Semitism arise? Before I seek to answer these questions, I will, in a first step, briefly depict the way in which historiographical works have understood anti-Semitism among populists until now. The first historian who focused on anti-Semitism in populism was Richard Hofstadter. In his famous work, The Age of Reform, published in 1955, he described the populist movement as deeply saturated by anti-Semitism. He identified a tendency of populism to analyze contemporary social, economic, and cultural conditions and grievances with the aid of conspiracy theories. Furthermore, he categorized the rhetoric populists used as anti-Semitic. Thus, Hofstadter concluded that, quote, "For many civil rights, the Jews was an organic part of the conspiracy theory," end of quote. In his narrative, populism blazed the trail for the rise of modern anti-Semitism in the United States of America. In the following decades, the work of Hofstadter provoked strong dissent in the historiographical community in the US. Historians questioned the great importance Hofstadter ascribed to conspiracy theories in general and anti-Semitism in particular. In the evolving struggle for interpretational sovereignty, the revisionist perspective held the upper hand. Driven by a strong political impetus, revisionists understood the populist movement as a political model. Lawrence Goodwin, one of the main exponents of the revisionist perspective, described populism as, quote, "the largest democratic mass movement in American history," end of quote. Norman Pollock, a historian inspired by Marxism, praised populism as an attempt to implement socialist elements in US society. Thus, although the argument of Hofstadter has never been really disproved, anti-Semitism got more and more out of the focus of historiography dealing with populism. In 1996, historian Jeffrey Ostler summarized this development with the following words, quote, "However, as study after study over the next decades failed to yield even a scrap of evidence to support the revisionists, a consensus developed that, as Lawrence Godwin recently wrote, the world of populism constructed by Hofstadter now languished in ruin. End of quote. Until now, revisionist perspectives are dominant in the historiographical community working on populism. And recent narratives, also not fueled by enthusiasm, or by the enthusiasm which drove historians in the 60s and 70s, the existence of anti-Semitism in the populist movement is still neglected. For historians like Joe Creech, the topic of anti-Semitism in the populist movement seems to be so irrelevant that he only mentioned in a footnote that some populists used the figuration of Shylock, but that anti-Semitic attitudes didn't exist among them. But if anti-Semitism would be really as unimportant for writing about populism as revisionists claim, how could cartoons like the one I introduced at the beginning be created? Why can you find numerous of articles in newspapers like the Southern Mercury, which was the official journal of the Farmers Alliance in Texas? Why were anti-Semitic figurations at the Rothschilds or Shylock so frequently used by populists? As I seek to show in the following, anti-Semitism was not as irrelevant as revisionist historians have claimed. However, I don't make a plea for a mere reanimation of Hofstadter's narrative. Instead, I argue for a different theoretical and methodological approach which assumes that gender is an essential category for the understanding of populism in general and populist anti-Semitism in particular. Whereas the historiography on populism and anti-Semitism mostly neglects gender as an analytical category for research, I understand contemporary perceptions of crisis of Anglo-American masculinity as deeply connected with the rise of anti-Semitic attitudes among populists in the US South. To trace these connections, I will briefly outline the socio-economic situation of large parts of the agrarian sector and the gendered perceptions of crisis linked to the economic development by contemporaries. In the second half of the 19th century, significant transformations in the economy of the South occurred. The introduction of the lien system after the end of the Civil War and the related orientation of a growing number of farmers towards markets resulted in declining prices of cotton. Whereas farmers sold a bale of cotton for 20.5 cents in the early 1870s, the price decreased to 4.59 cents per bale in 1893. Only once during the 1890s, the price of cotton broke through the break-even point. The resulting economic problems of many farmers were intensified by the monetary politics after the Civil War. The refusal of various governments to enlarge the circulating money supply produced a deflation which lasted over decades, and thus worsened the problems of the indebted farmers. More and more farmers got heavily indebted and had to mortgage their farms. Consequently, the number of yeomen, the term is used for independent farmers who cultivated their own land together with the members of the household. So consequently, the number of yeomen decreased and the quantity of tenants increased during the second half of the 19th century. The economic depression of the 1890s additionally intensified the economic problems of many farmers and fueled the expansion of tenantry. Whereas in 1880, only 37% of farmers in the South were tenants, the amount of tenant farmers rose to 47.2% in 1890. In response to these fundamental changes in the agrarian sectors, farmers' organizations were founded who intended to improve the situation of farmers and tenants and wage laborers in this sector. At the end of the 19th century, the Farmers Alliance was the biggest and most influential of these farmers' organizations and also one of the driving forces of populism. In 1890, 852,000 farmers in the South were members of the Farmers Alliance. By contemporaries, the problems the agrarian sector faced in the second half of the 19th century and the resulting decrease in numbers of yeomen were linked with gendered and racialized perceptions of threat. To understand the linkages contemporaries made between Jews and perceptions of crisis and masculinity, it is necessary to look at contemporary hegemonic constructions of Anglo-American masculinity. In the agrarian South, the figuration of the yeoman still served as a powerful ideal of masculinity during the decades of the second half of the 19th century. Economic independence, property ownership, and the cultivation of one's own land were understood as precondition of Anglo-American masculinity. In 1887, Alfred H. Colquitt, 49th governor of Georgia, described the sturdy independence of the yeoman as essential for a true man. By Southerners, the alleged way the yeoman led his life was linked to a specific masculinity he developed. Manual labor and his economic independence were connected to a virtuous, honest, and steady character. As a contemporary said in 1887 at the Interstate Convention of Farmers, now a quite long quote follows, "The farmer standing there, profiting by no man's misfortune, rising no man's ruin, not disturbed by passion, fueled by envy, or poisoned by malice, but tranquilly patient as the seasons themselves, orderly as nature, slow-pulsed and deep-breathed, pure of heart and clear of head, standing stalwart and independent in the sweat of his brow, as he locks the sunshine in the golden glory of his harvest, and spreads the showers in the verdure of fields, conscious of the integrity of his labor, that it enriches man while it honors God." End of quote. The subjectivity contemporaries ascribed to the yeoman not only made him the patriarch of his family who controlled the members of his household, rather he was also understood as the fundament of the Republican order. In this sense, Marion Butler, a leading protagonist of the Farmers' Alliance in North Carolina and a representative of the People's Party, that was a party of the populist movement. So Marion Butler, representative of the People's Party in the US Senate, described the, quote, "steady stream of pure blood from a high-class yeomanry," end of quote, as a necessary condition for the prosperity of a Republican society. Leonidas Polk, another leading representative of populism, characterized the yeoman as, quote, "mighty bulwark of liberty, the great conservator of the highest civilizations of the ages." Against the backdrop of this contemporary linkages between a specific configuration of masculinity and the well-being of the Republican order, the advancing demise of the agrarian sector and the related decreasing number of yeomen were perceived as a fundamental threat to the Southern way of life and as an attack on the Republican order of the US. The already mentioned Leonidas Polk understood the US to have to make the crucial decision, quote, "whether this is really a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, whether the citizen or the dollar is sovereign in the country, whether we shall have an aristocracy of wealth or an aristocracy of manhood and merit," end of quote. The Southern Mercury wrote in an article that the heartless gold-worshipping world, on the one hand, had set an end to citizenship of Anglo-American men, and on the other hand, had made it impossible for men to meet their manly obligations, so their alleged manly obligation, to protect and supply their family. These perceptions of emasculation and the interwoven idea of a deep crisis of the Republican order were very often negotiated by referring to the institution of slavery. One contemporary complained that, quote, "the lands are all owned by 30,000 individuals and the masses are but slaves and serfs," end of quote. Another contemporary lamented that the toilers of the soil were transformed into slaves and serfs of the moneyed oligarchy. Others interpreted the situation of Anglo-American men who lost their status as yeomen as even worse than the situation of African Americans during slavery. To understand the reasons for the socio-economic changes, for the alleged emasculation of Anglo-American men, and for the alleged demise of the Republican system in the United States, populists frequently make recourse to conspiracy theories. The monetary politics of the government, the low prices for cotton, and therefore the resulting growing number in tenants were understood as the result of a conspiracy against the farmers. Southerners identified a money aristocracy, money kings, money hoarders, or Wall Street gold barons as driving forces who used the conspiracy as a tool to plunder the laboring people and to appropriate the values farmers and laborers had produced. Among different groups of conspirators, Southern contemporaries also accused Jews of being responsible for the enslavement of the South in general and Southern men in particular. To put it in contemporary words, quote, the tyrannical and tiger-like instincts of the Gentile-hating Semites awoke toward us, end of quote. After plundering Great Britain and other European countries, the Tory Jew money power or the aristocratic and Jew money-lending classes tried to, quote, rob and plunder the American people of their industrial liberty and make them debt serfs like the people of Europe, end of quote. As main tools to rob the people, contemporaries identified the monetary politics. Jews were linked in multiple ways with the financial sphere. Accordingly, the Southern Mercury wrote, quote, it is astonishing with what success the lineal descendants of the money changers and bird sellers of the temple that Christ applied the front end of his sandals still ply the avocation of skinning the people through the bonding system, end of quote. To enforce this monetary politics, Jews, in this narrative, were created as a force influencing and controlling the main political institutions, as well as large parts of the press by bribery and corruption. An article titled American Slavery, published in the Southern Mercury in 1893, described this perceived social constellation with the following words, quote, the many are slaves to the few and the American government is no longer a republic. It is an oligarchy of moneylenders. The Bankers' Congress that meets regularly every fall is the de facto Congress of the United States, and the president of the Bankers' Congress is the de facto president of the United States. Some other contemporaries described the president of the United States, Grover Cleveland, as, quote, Lancelot Gobbo, a hired man for the Jews, who was being imagined as being dependent on the, quote, Jew and Yankee bank ring and the Jewish importers of New York, end of quote. Other contemporaries perceived the whole government as being bought by the Rothschilds. Driven by their ascribed greed and mammonism, Jews were therefore constructed as a fundamental threat to the social order and the connected dominant position Anglo-American men occupied within this society. As became clear, or at least I hope so, contemporary Southerners constructed Jews as a driving force of a conspiracy directed against the US in general and against farmers in particular. In this narrative, by ruining the independent farmer and subduing him to the money power, Jews emasculated Anglo-American men in a twofold way. First, they destroyed the economic independence, and second, they lowered Anglo-American men who were understood as keystones of the Republican order to slaves and serfs of the money aristocracy. This perception or construction of Jews as a fundamental threat to Anglo-American masculinity made it possible for contemporaries to come to the following strictly gendered and racialized conclusion. The Rothschilds world with its Shylocks are laughing at us American sheep. There was a quote. Therefore, anti-Semitism during populism has to be understood as a strategy to overcome a perceived crisis in Anglo-American masculinity and the interwoven perceptions of a crisis in the Republican system of the US. And thus, it was a strategy to stabilize and reconstitute the dominant position of Anglo-American men in society. Thank you.